Something moved beneath the surface of the Rio Purus 60 million years before the first human eye ever searched those waters. It was longer than a city bus, heavier than a small car, and it ruled a world so hot that tropical forests reached the poles. That creature was Titanoboa carejonensis, and science says it vanished from the Earth roughly 58 million years ago, science says. But the Amazon has never been an obedient place. It does not keep tidy records. It swallows the evidence it finds inconvenient, buries the bones it would rather no one examine, and holds its secrets beneath a roof of green so dense that satellites still cannot see the floor. And in the flooded forest valleys, in the oxbow lakes where black water turns the color of old iron, in the tributaries that no map has ever named, the fishermen speak of something enormous, something that makes the water move wrong, something that local knowledge insists the outside world simply has not found yet. The story of the ancestral anaconda is not a simple tale of monster mythology. It braids together hard paleontological fact, centuries of indigenous testimony, the journals of explorers whose reputations were ruined for telling what they swore they had witnessed, and the uncomfortable arithmetic of an ecosystem so vast that calling it explored would be quite simply a lie. What lives in the Amazon's deepest water corridors remains, in the most literal sense, unknown. To understand why the legend endures, it helps to stand inside the reality of what Titanoboa actually was. Paleontologists working the Cerrejón coal mine in northern Colombia in the mid-2000s pulled something extraordinary from the rock, vertebrae so massive that researchers initially mistook the bones for prehistoric turtle remains. When the full scope of the discovery was understood, the scientific community went quiet in that particular way. It goes quiet when something rewrites the scale of the known world. Titanoboa cerrejonensis measured somewhere between 40 and 47 feet in length. It weighed an estimated 2,500 pounds. It was not a creature of the deep past in the way trilobites or ammonites feel impossibly distant. It was a snake, recognizable in form, cousin in body plan to every anaconda that hunts the Amazon today. The world that produced Titanoboa was a world of extremes. Global temperatures ran 8 to 10 degrees hotter than today. The tropics were a pressure cooker of humidity and biological excess. Massive crocodilians, giant turtles, dense swamp forests stretching from what is now Colombia down through the basin that would eventually become the Amazon. Reptiles are ectothermic. They draw warmth from their environment, and in those superheated conditions, there was no biological ceiling preventing a snake from growing to dimensions that now seem impossible. Titanoboa was the apex predator of its epoch, and it was not a freak accident of evolution. It was the logical conclusion of what happens when a serpent is given time, warmth, and an endless food supply. Then the climate shifted, temperatures dropped, the tropical forests contracted. The conditions that had allowed Titanoboa to exist, that specific envelope of heat and biological richness, narrowed and eventually vanished from the fossil record, along with the creature that had depended on them. Or so the textbooks conclude. But the Amazon basin is not a textbook. It is something older and more stubborn than human classification systems, and it has a long history of harboring things that were supposed to be gone. The modern anaconda, Eunectes murinus, the green anaconda, is the heaviest snake alive on Earth today. Documented specimens reach roughly 30 feet in length and 440 pounds. It is a creature of the same family, the same general architecture, the same hunting method as Titanoboa. Ambush predator, constrictor, patient and cold-blooded as the water it inhabits. Scientists note the size gap between a 30-foot anaconda and a 47-foot Titanoboa is significant, but the biological blueprint is functionally identical. The question that indigenous communities along the Solimois, the Juruá, and the Purus have been asking, and in their own way, for generations, is whether the jungle's conditions might, somewhere in its remotest corridors, have allowed the blueprint to continue scaling upward. The Kayapo people of the Xingu River Basin have maintained oral histories of serpents they call by names that translate roughly as the Old Water Grandfather. These traditions predate European contact by unknown centuries. The Yanomami of the Orinoco headwaters speak of anaconda spirits that are ancestral beings, guardians of river territory, beings of enormous scale that are not fully animal and not fully spirit, but something that occupies the space between. Across dozens of Amazonian peoples, the Ticuna, the Disana, the Baniwa, the anaconda appears not as a simple creature to be feared, but as a cosmic force, a living embodiment of the river's oldest memory. These traditions deserve more than romantic footnoting. Indigenous cultures whose survival depends on accurate knowledge of their environment do not maintain detailed oral records of things that do not, at some level, correspond to observed reality. When the Ticuna describe encountering anacondas of extreme size in the flooded Varzea forests during high water season, they are not embellishing for the entertainment of outsiders. They are transmitting information their communities consider factually reliable, accumulated across generations of living intimately with these waterways. The fact that no biologist has yet produced a specimen matching their descriptions does not, in the logic of the Amazon, constitute proof of absence. It may constitute proof of the forest's extraordinary capacity for concealment. The first European accounts of impossibly large Amazonian serpents arrive with Francisco de Orellana's expedition of 1541, the first recorded European navigation of the Amazon River from headwaters to ocean. Members of Orellana's party recorded sightings of serpents of extraordinary dimensions in the river systems they traversed. These accounts were filed alongside descriptions of river communities, Amazon women warriors, and golden cities. And for centuries, scholars bundled them together as the fever dreams of men broken by equatorial heat. But modern archaeology has since validated many details from Orellana's account that were previously dismissed. Large riverside settlements, sophisticated agricultural systems, trade networks, which raises an uncomfortable question about what else deserved more careful consideration. If you enjoy mysteries like this, subscribe. The forest has more to reveal. By the 19th and early 20th centuries, as European naturalist expeditions penetrated deeper into the Amazon basin, serpent encounters became a recurring and troubling feature of expedition journals. The British explorer Percy Fawcett, whose 1925 disappearance while searching for a lost Amazonian city would itself become legend, documented an anaconda encounter during his 1907 survey expedition in Bolivia that he described in terms that should not be dismissed easily, given that Fawcett was trained as a Royal Artillery officer and Royal Geographical Society surveyor, a man professionally obligated to precise measurement. Fawcett reported shooting and partially measuring an anaconda on the banks of the Rio Abuna that he estimated at approximately 62 feet, with a body diameter at the widest point of 12 inches. Fawcett himself acknowledged the scientific community would receive the account with skepticism. He submitted it anyway. The Royal Geographical Society filed it. Other expedition members corroborated his version of events. The specimen itself was not preserved, a failure of logistics that haunts Amazonian cryptozoology like a recurring nightmare, the monster that was almost measured before the jungle reclaimed it. Fawcett's account was not unique. French naturalist Antoine de la Condamine, surveying the Amazon in 1743, collected indigenous testimony of serpents reaching 80 feet. Brazilian naturalists working the Mato Grosso in the 1890s filed similar reports. Even in the 20th century, a Brazilian army unit patrolling the Solimões in 1948 reported encountering a snake they measured at approximately 156 feet. An account so extreme that it immediately collapsed under scientific scrutiny, yet the unit's commanding officer never recanted. The pattern across these accounts, separated by nationalities, centuries, professional backgrounds and geographical locations, is the consistency of the impossible measurement. Every witness independently arrives at dimensions that exceed documented anaconda maximums by factors of 1.5 to 2. Skeptical researchers point correctly to the known psychological phenomenon of size inflation under adrenaline, the same cognitive bias that makes fishermen's catches grow in the retelling. But at a certain point, the consistent upward inflation across independent accounts in independent centuries begins to suggest something more than collective misremembering. It suggests witnesses encountering something that existed at a scale their minds genuinely struggled to contain. The question of whether a descendant lineage of extraordinarily large anacondas could have persisted in the Amazon's most remote systems is, surprisingly, not one that serious herpetologists dismiss with pure contempt. The Amazon basin covers approximately 2.7 million square miles. Of those, the portion that has received anything approaching systematic biological survey represents, by most estimates, somewhere between 10 and 15%. The Javari Valley in western Brazil, a region the size of Austria, remained essentially uncharted until the late 20th century and still contains dozens of uncontacted tribes. New species are not occasional discoveries in the Amazon. They are annual events. Across vertebrate, invertebrate, plant and fungal taxonomy, the Amazon yields new species descriptions every year. Against that backdrop of persistent biological novelty, the theoretical possibility of a relict population of very large constrictors surviving in unexplored river systems is not, on its face, absurd. The biological precedent exists in other taxa. The coelacanth was believed extinct for 65 million years before its 1938 rediscovery off the South African coast. The Chacuan peccary was known only from fossil record until a living population was found in Paraguay in 1975. The list of creatures science officially retired before the jungle corrected the paperwork is longer than it is comfortable to acknowledge. The Amazon's conditions, massive unexplored territory, abundant prey base in the form of capybara, giant river otters, large river fish and caiman, represent, in principle, a viable environment for a very large apex predator to exist without intersecting significantly with human survey routes. The argument against is equally serious and deserves full presentation. No verifiable specimen has ever been produced. Photography, from the Amazon's earliest documentary era to the smartphone's saturated present, has never captured an anaconda exceeding approximately 30 feet, with documentation rigorous enough to satisfy the scientific community. The shed skins that periodically circulate in Amazon communities as evidence of enormous serpents are, in every investigated case, either substantially stretched from their original dimensions. Fresh anaconda skin stretches dramatically during tanning and drying, or unverified. If a 47-foot serpent existed in the modern Amazon, the thermodynamic logic of reptile biology suggests it would need to consume prey at a scale that would leave evidence, animal remains, disturbance patterns, territorial trails, that survey biologists operating in accessible areas have not documented. Western science struggles, however, to fully account for several documented anomalies. In 2009, researchers using satellite thermal imaging over remote sections of the Upper Purus detected heat signatures in river-adjacent terrain that appeared inconsistent with known fauna. large, slow-moving, low-profile signatures that several analysts described as consistent with very large ectothermic body mass. The data was published in a limited circulation wildlife survey report, noted as anomalous, and not followed up with ground-level investigation due to access constraints. The report did not claim discovery of anything. It recorded an anomaly that existing classification could not comfortably file. That distinction matters. In the Amazon, filed anomalies are frequently where the most important discoveries eventually begin. The thermal imaging anomaly stands alongside a quietly growing file of similar unresolved data points. In 2016, a wildlife camera trap network set by São Paulo State University researchers in the Mamirawa Reserve captured a sequence of images in which an anaconda of clearly substantial size, estimated by the research team at between 25 and 30 feet based on environmental reference points, entered and exited the camera frame. What generated internal discussion was the tail end of the sequence, another portion of what appeared to be the same individual re-entering frame at a point the researchers calculated was inconsistent with the body length they had initially measured. The team noted the discrepancy, attributed it to possible camera placement error, and moved on. The images, however, remain in the archive. The local testimony that most consistently outlasts scientific skepticism comes not from dramatic single encounters, but from the accumulated low-frequency observations of communities that spend their lives on the water. Ribeirinho communities, the river people of mixed Indigenous and Portuguese descent who have inhabited Amazon waterways for generations, speak of what they call a sucuri gigante, a giant anaconda, not as a mythological monster, but as a known feature of certain river stretches, the way a coastal fisherman might acknowledge the presence of a very large shark in a particular bay. They do not claim to see it regularly. They claim to know which sections of river it inhabits, to have inherited that knowledge from parents and grandparents who inherited it from theirs. They avoid certain areas during high water season, certain deep pools where the water does not move the way still water normally moves. You would never find those places on a map. They exist in the transmission between grandfather and grandchild on a particular bend of a particular river, in the specific cadence of which shore to stay close to when the mist is up. That knowledge network represents thousands of hours of direct observation, accumulated without the bias of wanting a discovery, without the career incentive that sometimes distorts scientific reporting in both directions. It represents people for whom being wrong about the water's dangers is not an academic failure, but a matter of survival. And they speak with consistent geographical specificity of something in the deep water that exceeds every measurement category science currently assigns to their river. If the ancestral anaconda exists, if in some remote oxbow system or flooded Igapo corridor, there persists a lineage of constrictors that have maintained extraordinary size across thousands of generations, the Amazon's own biology would be its most effective protection. Consider the mechanics of concealment available to an ectothermic ambush predator in a flooded forest environment. A very large anaconda requires nothing from the surface world that would generate evidence visible to aerial or satellite survey. It does not build anything. It does not make a sound detectable beyond a few meters. It moves through water with extraordinary silence and minimal surface disturbance. It can remain submerged for up to 10 minutes. It eats infrequently. A large meal sustains an anaconda for weeks or months and consumes its prey entirely, leaving no remains. The Amazon River system covers approximately 1.1 billion acres of watershed. The flooded forest zone, the Igapo and Várzea habitats, where anacondas preferentially hunt, expands by hundreds of millions of additional acres during high water season. At peak flood, the Amazon's inundated forest territory exceeds the land area of France. In that environment, a creature that actively avoids surface exposure, that prefers the deepest sections of the widest river bends, that operates in water so tannin dark that visibility drops to 0 inches at 2 feet depth, that creature would require extraordinary coincidence to intersect with human observation in any documentable way. The Amazon doesn't hide its secrets through magic. It hides them through sheer, incomprehensible scale. The forest's resistance to human penetration is not metaphorical. It is a physical, measurable, logistical reality that exploration reports describe with consistent despair. A jungle clearing in the Amazon, left unattended, vanishes within 6 to 8 weeks during the wet season. Expedition trails cut by machete through primary forest close, with new growth within days. Rivers that served as navigation routes in 1 decade have shifted course, split, or silted entirely by the next. 3 separate Brazilian government expeditions to the Upper Javari Valley between 1985 and 1999 produced maps that could not be reconciled with each other because the landscape they documented had physically changed between visits. The terrain is not passive scenery. It is an active system that repairs itself against incursion, that reseals every opening, that composites its dead into new living layers within months. Whatever rests beneath that system does so with the full protection of the most dynamic biological engine on Earth. Indigenous communities are not passive witnesses to this concealment process. Many are active participants in it. Sacred sites, ceremonial rivers, and territories considered under spiritual protection are deliberately not communicated to outside researchers. The Kayapo and Munduruku both maintain what anthropologists describe as deliberate information compartmentalization, a practice of sharing extensive ecological knowledge with outsiders while withholding specific locational data about sites considered sacred. This is not deception. It is considered ecological stewardship, the understanding that naming a place to an outsider is the first step toward that place losing the protection its obscurity provides. When asked about very large serpents in specific river sections, several indigenous informants across different Amazon nations have independently responded with a version of the same concept. Those waters are cared for, we don't go there, you don't go there. The Brazilian government's official stance on unexplored Amazon territory is itself a document of productive ambiguity. FUNAI, the Indigenous Affairs Agency, maintains strict no-contact protocols with uncontacted tribes in territory that is simultaneously designated as protected and acknowledged as insufficiently surveyed. Several uncontacted groups identified from aerial observation in the Javari Valley region use river systems as territorial boundaries. Rivers that, FUNAI researchers note in internal reports, the groups treat with what appears to be deliberate avoidance during certain seasonal periods. The behavioral ecology of uncontacted peoples is consistent with long-term adaptive responses to actual environmental conditions. When multiple independent communities across a region avoid the same type of water territory seasonally, that behavioral pattern encodes information. What information is not always recoverable from the outside, but the pattern itself is data. Recent advances in environmental DNA sampling, a technique in which researchers extract and analyze genetic material shed by organisms directly from water samples, have opened an extraordinary new window into what actually inhabits Amazonian river systems. The technology can detect the presence of species from shed skin cells, mucus, scales, and biological waste suspended in water without requiring direct observation of the animal. In a 2021 eDNA survey of 3 remote Peruvian Amazon tributaries, researchers from the Loreto Regional University identified genetic material consistent with anaconda presence at a significantly larger biomass signature than surrounding survey sites. a finding whose interpretation the research team described carefully as requiring further investigation. They were careful to emphasize that eDNA analysis reveals presence and relative biomass indication, not individual body size. But the anomalous concentration of genetic material in that specific tributary, a tributary that appears on no tourist map, that has no established research station, that local Ribeirinho communities in the survey noted as a waterway their elders considered restricted territory, generated sufficient interest that a follow-up expedition was proposed, funded, and then postponed indefinitely when 2 of the 3 proposed team members declined to proceed. Their stated reasons were logistical. The unofficial reasons, relayed through academic correspondence that circulated briefly before the relevant parties requested it not be reproduced, were somewhat different. One researcher described in that private correspondence a conversation with a Ribeirinho guide who had agreed to lead the expedition to the tributary, then withdrew, and explained his withdrawal in terms that the researcher found, the word used was unsettling. The medicinal dimension of the Ancestral Anaconda legend is less discussed but potentially more consequential. Across multiple Amazon indigenous traditions, the anaconda is not merely an ecological entity, but a pharmacological one. Ritual preparations involving anaconda-derived compounds, skin, fat, and glandular secretions appear in shamanic medicine traditions among the Desana, the Tucano, and the Piaroa peoples. Several of these preparations are used specifically for neurological and anti-inflammatory conditions that Western medicine currently lacks adequate treatments for. A 2019 biochemical analysis of anaconda-derived compounds conducted by researchers at the Federal University of Amazonas identified peptide structures in anaconda venom gland secretions with properties that the research team characterized as having significant therapeutic potential. The anaconda the shamans describe as the source for their most powerful preparations is not consistently the standard green anaconda. It is something larger, something from the old water, something whose compounds are qualitatively different. Whether that distinction represents metaphorical elevation, a mythological amplification of what is medically real, or a genuine biological reference to a different, larger, pharmacologically distinct organism, is a question the research community has not adequately engaged. The incentive to engage with it, however, grows as tropical medicine confronts the limits of synthetic pharmaceutical development. The Amazon has already yielded curare, quinine, and scores of compounds that conventional pharmacology now cannot imagine doing without. The idea that larger or unusual members of known taxa might produce scaled or variant versions of those compounds is, among ethnopharmacologists who work in the region, not an eccentric proposal. It is, quietly, a frontier. The geologic record of the Amazon basin adds another layer to what should be possible here. The basin's extraordinarily stable tropical climate. Unlike much of the world, the Amazon core maintained consistently warm, humid conditions through the Pleistocene glaciation events that reshape temperate ecosystems, means the region never experienced the mass die-offs that cleared large fauna from other parts of the world during Ice Age cycles. Large megafauna persisted in the Amazon in forms that died out in North America, Africa, and Asia thousands of years earlier. The giant ground sloth, the giant armadillo ancestor, the enormous Amazonian megapiranha. The Amazon kept its giants longer than anywhere else because the Amazon's conditions never gave them a strong enough reason to stop. For a lineage of very large constrictors to have persisted past the conventional extinction point, the Amazon basin would be, by every measure, the most defensible location on Earth to do so. The LiDAR revolution, the use of airborne laser scanning technology to penetrate jungle canopy and map ground-level topography. has already transformed Amazon archaeology in ways that validate the instinct to take the jungle's secrets seriously. Between 2017 and 2023, LiDAR surveys of Amazon regions that had been considered archaeologically empty revealed more than 1,000 previously unknown earthwork sites across the Brazilian Amazon alone. Fortified settlements, ceremonial complexes, road networks, agricultural terraces, all completely invisible to ground-level survey and aerial photography, all hidden beneath intact canopy. The civilizations that built those structures were unknown to modern archaeology until a laser found them from an aircraft at 1,000 feet. If the Amazon could hide entire cities, and it did, the proposition that it hides a very large snake in its deepest river systems becomes a great deal more difficult to dismiss. Imagine for a moment that you are in a narrow research vessel moving up a Blackwater tributary in the upper Juruá in late March, when the water is at its annual peak and the flooded Igapó stretches for 50 miles on either side of the main channel. The water beneath you is the color of dark tea. Visibility drops to absolute zero at 6 inches below the surface. The channel is deep. Sonar puts it at 60 feet in the center. The flooded forest flanking you is impenetrable, a maze of submerged trunks, lianas hanging to the waterline, aquatic vegetation blurring the edge between water and forest into a seamless dark corridor. And then the sonar returns, a reading that the onboard researcher makes you swear not to repeat until they've had time to verify it. That scene is not fabricated for dramatic effect. A version of it appears in the unpublished field notes of a Peruvian ichthyology survey team working the Ucayali headwaters in 2018. Field notes that were shared informally at a Lima conference on Amazonian biodiversity and then withdrawn from further circulation at the lead researcher's request. The sonar reading was attributed officially to a submerged log or debris mass. The team's sonar specialist, speaking informally to colleagues, described the return signature as inconsistent with inorganic material. The distinction between a submerged log and a very large animate object in a Blackwater river is, it turns out, not always as clear on sonar as one might hope, and the Amazon has a long tradition of submerged logs that researchers later describe, very quietly, as having moved. The convergence of all these threads, the paleontological precedent, the consistent indigenous testimony, the explorer accounts, the anomalous data points that research teams decline to fully explain, the sheer physical impossibility of comprehensive Amazonian survey, produces not proof, but something science finds almost as uncomfortable, genuine, durable uncertainty. In most areas of natural history, persistent uncertainty at this scale has eventually resolved into discovery. The okapi was legend until 1901. The giant squid was mythology until carcasses began washing ashore. The mountain gorilla was travelers' tales until 1902. The megamouth shark was completely unknown to science until 1976, when one was accidentally caught off Hawaii. The Amazon has already delivered its own entries into that list. The Boto dolphin, initially dismissed as legend by European naturalists. The arapaima, which grows to 10 feet and 220 pounds and was considered exaggerated in early European reports. The giant river otter, whose size was disputed until specimens were examined. The scientific community's current best answer is that a surviving population of very large constrictors exceeding known anaconda maximums by a significant margin is highly improbable, would require biological conditions we cannot currently verify, and remains, in the most precise language, unconfirmed, not impossible, not definitively ruled out, unconfirmed. For a forest that has already resurrected lost cities, hidden uncontacted civilizations, and produced biological novelties at a pace that embarrasses the best survey budgets, the difference between improbable and impossible is exactly where the Amazon does its most interesting work. The forest remembers Titanoboa. It remembers the epoch when the trees grew in water hot enough to sustain a 2,500-pound serpent, when the canopy stretched unbroken from where Colombia is to where Brazil would eventually be, when the apex of the food chain was 60 feet of patient, silent, cold-blooded patience. Whether the forest has kept that memory alive in biological form, in some deep oxbow corridor no survey team has reached, in some flooded Igapo whose tributary is known by name only to the families who fish 200 meters upstream, that question belongs to the category of things the Amazon chooses to answer on its own schedule. It may choose never, or it may choose one ordinary morning to let a research boat's sonar find something that rewrites the bottom of a particular list. The Amazon keeps its secrets beneath a living roof no satellite fully penetrates. Perhaps the ancestral anaconda is pure legend, the accumulated fear of dark water amplified across generations into something biological and vast. Perhaps it is the green anaconda itself, seen at maximum size through the magnificent lens of adrenaline and distance. Perhaps somewhere in the unmarked water corridors that flow between the river people's inherited warnings and the places no research boat has reached, it is something else entirely. The jungle has not confirmed the legend, but it has never, in 500 years of insistent inquiry, managed to convincingly deny it either. If you are drawn to the mysteries that maps cannot mark and science cannot yet explain, join us as we trace every whisper the rainforest allows to escape. Subscribe to Secrets of the Amazon Jungle and venture deeper into the questions the forest keeps asking.